Thank you, Sarah. Evening, everybody. I can't see everybody. I'm assuming some of you have chosen not to put your cameras on, which is absolutely fine. But really lovely to see you, and thank you for giving up your time. I won't introduce myself because Sarah has now done that. But let me say at the beginning, I'm not facilitating this session as an expert of what September will look like. I am afraid I have no crystal ball and I can't tell you exactly, but what the focus is on is some strategies really for leading effectively during, I think, probably the most challenging situation in our lifetime, and certainly as school leaders. And hopefully within the hour or by the end of the hour, we may have reflected and thought about some of those strategies that will help us. So I have got to learn how to share a screen. So bear with me for 2 seconds. I've had a new skill taught to me this evening, which hopefully is working. So we're looking at how we can lead effectively in a really complex world. We're going to have a couple of breakout sessions during the course of this hour, and Kate will organise that. So there is some discussion and an opportunity to share ideas. And if you have any questions as the session goes on, please feel free to put those in the chat, and Kate and Sarah will look at those and draw my attention to those if I need to. I think there is no doubt, oops, bear with me for a second. Oh, I can't get it to move on. Oh, there we are. There is no doubt that the times that we're leading in at the moment are unprecedented, and I think they are the most challenging that any school leaders have ever had to cope with. They're sudden, they're dramatic, they're uncertain, and what makes it, I think, quite unique and even more complex is we're going through it all together. So it's impacting not only our professional lives, but also our personal lives. And usually as school leaders, we may have to take people through a challenge, but we've got the comfort and convenience of home to go back to. We are on shaky ground and wobbly ground in terms of that personally as well as professionally. So for me, it is really an ultimate test of our leadership, because it's during those sorts of times that our leadership is most important. It's easy to lead when everything is comfortable and when everything is stable. Actually, real leadership comes to the fore when we are in these challenging times. So apart from the obvious reasons why this is so difficult for us, I think there are two really complex things that are happening that are making it challenging for us as senior leaders. There is no doubt there is a huge emotional roller coaster, and we go through it daily, we go through it weekly. And that emotional roller coaster is something we're going through as senior leaders, but also our staff are going through, our students are going through, our parents are going through, and of course our communities are going through. And we're all going through that roller coaster at different paces, and we're all at different times. And we've coming through this crisis at different speeds. So we've all got different perspectives. When we closed, I thought it was quite interesting. We sort of rallied together and there was almost a bit of a high, because it was really clear what we had to do. We were all in the same place. We were given very short notice. We had to close. We had to get some sort of online learning going, and boom, we went into action mode. And we're pretty good at that, and we were pretty comfortable. As we started to prolong that, and as we started to think about opening schools, that's when we're realizing everybody, including ourselves, are all in different places. We're also coming towards the end of the academic year. We're tired, and this situation has been going on for 3.5 months. Most of you here have had no break whatsoever, and even when you've technically been on holiday, you haven't. So we're extremely tired, and we're emotionally tired, which obviously makes the situation difficult. The other thing I think that makes this much more complex to manage is nobody has been through it before. So there's no go-to person that you can go and talk through their experience and learn from. We're all going through it together. We've all got a view about what should or shouldn't be happening, but actually none of us know. And we won't know whether what we're doing at the moment is successful really for another 5 to 10 years. We won't know if everything we're doing in terms of online learning and live teaching and all of that stuff is working, and we won't know properly for another few years. So we're having to grapple through this together. There's no reassurance from one person who can say, that happened to me, this is what I did, this is why it worked, and this is why it didn't work. I don't think we've ever been in that sort of situation. So we really do, as senior leaders in this time, carry what I call the burden of command. It's a lonely place to be in, and although you may well be surrounded by people, you're carrying the thought processes of what's happening, how you're going to get through it on your own. If you're ahead, nobody is walking in your shoes, so nobody can really appreciate what it's like for you. That's a burden. There is a real lack of clarity around September. We're getting there, but we're getting there piecemeal. We're hearing it by word of mouth rather than having a proper conversation with our leaders in terms of what's going to happen. Everybody has a view. And if you go on Twitter, I don't know if you're all on Twitter, but you will encounter 10, 20, 50 different views in the case of a day, and everybody being absolutely confident they are right. And at the end of the day, they don't know, as I said before, and you have to make the decisions that are best for you. It's a little bit like, although obviously it's much more significant than that, a snow day, where everyone has a view, everybody comes from a different perspective. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't, but somehow you've got to make the decision that's based on your rationale, your understanding of what's right for your school. This is the same sort of process, but with a much, much bigger problem. So if you've come to the table this evening feeling stressed, feeling really frantic and fraught and worried, that's okay. It's normal. There's nothing to be concerned about that. And if other people appear to be coping with it much better and say they're not worried, they're either not telling you the truth or they're not doing something they should do. So it's perfectly natural and normal for you to be feeling stressed. And we talk a lot about this, leadership and management, and when do you need what? And there's no doubt that we need both of these in abundance. But it's really important when you're leading in these sorts of times that you use the right one in the right way at the right time. So early on, when we had to close, I would say our management skills came to the fore. It was urgent action, it was immediate action, it needed strong direction, fast pace, there was a bit of an adrenaline rush, and it was short term. We all know what we needed to do. And as I said at the beginning, a lot of us probably felt quite comfortable with that. And certainly the heads that I work with now, there were a number of them that within the first couple of weeks that said, Jan, actually, I'm quite enjoying this. It's different, it's stimulating, and I could see exactly why. However, as it's gone on and as we enter this period now and travel through this period now, there is no doubt that the leadership side of our skills have to come to the fore. We cannot be leading in management style. We've got to be leading. So we need to be guiding and supporting people. We need to be having that long-term view about what we think might happen, anticipating ahead as much as we possibly can, delegating to people who are going to be your experts around your table. And one of the most important things, but most difficult things to do during a crisis is we have to trust people to get on with the job that they know needs to be done. That is much more difficult. We tend very much in a crisis to overmanage and underlead. And that can lead to really controlling and centralizing behavior, which in itself can slow decisions down. And I do think it's worth you reflecting, particularly if you're ahead, and I think most of you, if not all, are senior leaders. How is that at the moment? How controlling is your leadership? Are you letting things go? Are you centralizing things? And is that helpful or not? And that might need an honest reflection on your part. What I think and what I would say is your team need clarity around expectation, the broad principles that you are adopting in this crisis, some key messages that you want to hear, one of which must be thank you and appreciative of the work that they're doing. And they need you to trust them and let them go within that framework. Your job, particularly as a head, is to build a really cohesive team around you where everybody understands what role they've got to play And your job then is to check in with them that they are carrying out that role and that they have the resources and the environment they need in which to do that. So given all of that, that's a lot to take in terms of where we're at, I think we'll move to a sort of pause point and a breakout. I'm going to hand over to Kate and Sarah in a second, but I want you to think about what is challenging you at the moment. It might be some of what I've already mentioned. It might be something different. And I'm going to give you about 10 minutes. I think we've got enough time to make it around 10 minutes to share with your group, to offload a little bit around what are the major challenges for you at this moment in time. So, whoops. Oh, I'm getting a bit footloose with that. So, Kate or Sarah, I'm going to hand over to you to move people into the breakout rooms.
Yep, ready to go.
If there's time, there is another opportunity to have a discussion. Okay, so most of what you've said, whoops, I did anticipate you would say. There we are. I think IT, in all that encompasses, has helped, but is also an issue for us. The lack of infrastructure, the lack of readiness, the lack of people understanding what is involved in getting that up and ready, the live teaching and the issues around that. I think also we're all probably a little bit fed up with virtual stuff. I know I am. It was novel to begin with, and I thought, oh gosh, you can actually do quite a lot by having these sorts of calls. But I now crave face-to-face discussion. You can't pick up the nuances with people. You cannot build relationships and lead in quite the same way. So leading and motivating your staff remotely is a real challenge, and it's tough. Lack of clarity for September, that fog, and we are getting it piecemeal. And I will in a while, I'll just sort of feed in what I have picked up in terms of what September is likely to look at. DFE guidance documents. I mean, goodness, has anybody actually counted how many we have a day, these updates? Those of you that are on the update service. I only hooked into that about 3 weeks ago because somebody recommended I do it. I cannot believe how many they are. And every time, of course, a document comes, although they do slightly say what they've added, you're never quite sure whether you've missed something. Do I need to read that one, or do I not need to read that one? Gaps in young people's learning, an obvious one. And of course, our young people, our children, you know, we care for them, we worry about them, we know them. What is their lockdown experience like? We know the vulnerable children, but there are also quiet children that we don't know very much about. What's happening to them? We miss them, actually. That's our reason for being. And I think we're all desperate to get back to them as soon as possible. So there's some really significant challenges for us. And if you add on the staffing issue, which I think is a really valid one to put in there, you really deeply carry that burden of command. Now, you may have come across this before. I think this is Covey has developed this, and it can be used in a whole variety of ways, but I actually think it's quite useful in this situation. And we can be really, really guilty of trying to control far more than we really can control. So if you look at that circle of control right in the middle there, when you think about it, there is very, very little that you can directly control. And that is effectively your behavior. And we'll come on to why that's important in a second. But what you can do a lot of is that circle of influence. So there is a great deal that you can influence, and you can start influencing from this point if you can take that strategic long-term view. But we ultimately spend a lot of time in that circle of concern, really worrying about things that are completely and utterly out of our control. So there is no point in worrying about them. And I'll go through what I think you're probably worrying about in a minute and where they potentially fit. So those first two circles, that circle of control and that circle of influence, are the two circles we need to be spending our time in and focusing in. Anything in our challenges that is in the circle of concern, out of our control, we should put to one side. There will be ifs and buts with every single scenario. Every time there is an announcement on the television about the virus, there's always ifs and buts. Well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Ultimately, as I said at the beginning, none of us know. And most of those ifs and buts are completely and utterly out of your control. So another pause for thought. I want you to go back into your breakout rooms just for 5 minutes this time. Those challenges that we've just talked about and more that you may well have jotted down, where do they fit in those circles? And then we will come back to some of the things that may be in those circles and what we can ultimately do about them as leaders. So Kate, I'm going to hand over to you again. Whoops. And just for 5 minutes in the breakout rooms, okay? Ideally. So hopefully you've had the chance to sort of go back to the challenges that you talked about and sort of map them according to where you think they are. There we are. So I'm going to anticipate the sorts of things that you might have had and where they would sit. So the circle of concern, the things that we don't know and can do absolutely nothing about. So at the moment, although we are getting bits and pieces of information, we don't know what September will look like. So there is no point time to guess until you've got something concrete to think about. We don't know how the virus will behave and what the timeline to a vaccine is going to be. So again, there is no point trying to anticipate whether the virus will have a second wave, and if it does have a second wave, when is that second wave going to be? We may not. We can only deal with what we know. We don't know what the format of exams are going to be next year, or the format of assessments. The guidance and the social distancing requirements. Now we've had a bit this week around that, but it will be whatever the government says, and we have to work within that. The second wave I've talked about, we don't know when Ofsted is going to kick back in. I am an inspector, as Sarah said, and actually I get regular updates. There is nothing indicated at the moment around a return to Ofsted. And I think Ofsted themselves are treading very carefully around that for obvious reasons. I know Gavin Williamson has said that Ofsted may look at the £1 billion and how that's being spent, and is it being spent appropriately? But there's absolutely nothing concrete, and nothing has come internally within Ofsted around that. And there will be lots more. Your job within that sort of circle really is to just anticipate and think about your own context, but don't dwell and don't assume you will know where your young people will be. This is the circle where you should really start focusing your energies now, because this is where you can influence the direction of travel for your school and for your staff. And actually, by getting this right, they will often take care of those things that are in the circle of concern. So we do know that there is going to be a blended approach to learning. It's inevitable. As much as they say they want all young people to come back into school, it's inevitable that there will be some element of a blended approach. We also know that schools will be open in September in some way, shape or form. Now, the intelligence I am picking up is that primary schools are expected to be back with all young people and operating in bubbles of 30. So that for many primary schools is something on paper that can be manageable, but obviously that's linked to staffing. The guidance around shielding will change in August. So those staff that have been shielding and not coming in may well be able to come in. Obviously, you'll have to sort of deal with that with risk assessments. We do know that we are likely to need an IT infrastructure that is really secure, fit for purpose, that enables remote learning as and when you need it. We know that things can change very, very quickly, and they are likely to change very quickly. We may well go down into lockdown again if we have a second wave, but we might not. So having that backup plan ready to go, anticipating and preparing for that now will be important. We are likely to have reduced numbers of staff, perhaps not as many reduced as we might have thought this time last week because of the change in the guidance yesterday. But inevitably, if the virus is still around, which of course it will be, there will be some staff that are unwell and some students. And we absolutely know that some children and young people will not be in the same place of their learning as they have done previously in previous year groups. But we shouldn't make assumptions about that. And it's very much for me a bespoke process. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And we know that everyone will find return challenging, regardless of what their experience in lockdown has been. They will find it challenging, even for people for whom lockdown has not necessarily been a negative experience. A sudden shift in routine, having spent 3 or 4, perhaps even 6 months doing one thing, will be a challenge for them. So we know that we're going to have people coming back with all sorts of experiences. There will be more to add to that list, but these are the sorts of things that you know are going to be needed. So that's where your focus of attention needs to be. For me, I think there are 4 key aspects to what you can influence now and start thinking about now. First and foremost, in many ways, is the well-being. We know people are going to need some support. And actually, I put your well-being right at the top of that list. You will have been working flat out, probably since February. You will not have had a day's holiday. We were talking whilst you're in your breakout rooms that even if you are technically on holiday, if you've been at home, the chances are you've been dragged into work. And even if you're checking emails, you're going to be dragged into those emails. So you do need to make sure over those summer holidays that you build some time in for yourself to truly switch off and recuperate. Mental health and well-being will be a key part of what you do in your schools when you return in September. So what programs can you put in place for staff and for students? Really think carefully about workload, particularly between that period of September to December. Anything that's on your calendar that you don't really need to be on your calendar in that time, I would recommend you get rid of and you move now. Starting to think about flexible working. We've shown that actually you can work more flexibly. It's not necessarily easy, it's not necessarily the best way, but it can work. So starting to think about how that might operate in your school, particularly again between September and December. And plenty of opportunities for play and for social activities, because that is what people will crave. That's what they've missed. Structured, obviously, and guidance followed, but give those opportunities for people. The IT, will it be fit for purpose in September? So focus on that now. What are you likely to be looking at in September? What do you want to be available in September? And where is your ICT infrastructure in relation to that? If you had to close tomorrow, could it cope with that and create what you want? If you had half and half, could you manage that? Re-engagement. I would treat the period in September as a period of transition. We're very skilled at managing the transition of young people back into school at key movement times. And I would treat September like that. It's big scale, it's big, no doubt. But I would use all the approaches that you use to accommodate year 7, to accommodate year 12, to accommodate reception into year 1, nursery, and so on. Focusing on routines and habits, it will be those that have gone. I struggle with the routines as an adult. Your young people absolutely will have gone out the window. If they haven't got parents and carers at home who are really reinforcing the need to maintain that routine, they are going to find it exceptionally difficult to get up at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning in September to come in. We're meeting young people in some of my schools that are getting used to sleeping in until 3 o'clock. Their whole routine has gone upside down. Now that's inexcusable, but I don't know what situation they've got at home, but you may well be encompassing that. Look at your curriculum. What flexibility do you have in your curriculum to give you an opportunity to focus on the things that you need to focus on? There is nothing better than good quality teaching to get children back to where they need to be. So some really robust assessment to really think about how are we going to assess where our young people are in their learning. And then what great quality teaching do we need to fill those gaps, and what resources do we need? So you're almost honing in on those key things. Anything that you don't need, where you've got some flexibility, you might want to think about parking until after Christmas. And think about those bubble scenarios. So we're fairly confident that primary will be operating in bubbles of 30. The intelligence at the moment is that Key Stage 3 could be operating in bubbles of 30, but there does appear to be a shift at secondary level to getting whole year groups back. Now, that more, I think, will come over the next few days, and I believe the firm announcements will be towards the end of next week. But there is no doubt there is a huge political will to get every single child back into school in September in some way, shape or form. It's going to be more complex for secondaries, no doubt, because of the structure of their timetable, but there will be an expectation that that happens. It could be staggered starts, staggered lunch, staggered end of days. Now that's not easy to think about, but working through some of those scenarios will be good to do now. Now, some of you might be sitting here thinking, oh my goodness, I can't even get my head around that. But there will be somebody on your team for whom that sort of challenge they love. Get them looking and modeling those sorts of scenarios. Use the expertise that you have in your team. And the last big thing that I think we need to think about this side that will become really important in September is community. I think things will become a lot more localized. People will be less willing to travel further. I think they will be more accepting of local shops. And so they will start to use their community in a way that they perhaps haven't done before. And I think head teachers and senior leaders in schools are emerging as really important and strong community leaders. And that's a really powerful and good role to play within your community. So connect with parents as much as you can. Connect with key workers, particularly of those that work with your vulnerable children. And then, of course, as part of that, collaborate, share, talk to each other about what you can do together. Most importantly, within all of that, and this is where it requires you to be brave, you have to work in your context. Now, I've shown, it's a bit of an unusual one, and I'm not suggesting you want to go into a battleground like this, but the concept of the Roman tortoise, when they went into battle, I think is a really good one here. You, in a sense, want to put a shield around your school and around your community and protect your staff and your students as much as possible from what's going on out there. Of course, we need to keep an eye on things. Of course, we need to know what's working and what's not working and what is expected of us. But actually, what we will see is that these things have to operate within a local context. And so you have to protect your staff, your students, and your school from things that they need to be protective of. And if that might mean you have to operate a little bit like the tortoise. And there may be local outbreaks, there may be local second waves, and you suddenly find yourself in a position of buttoning down the hatches because actually something's happened in your local area. And we've seen that. We've seen outbreaks in China within, I think, related to a market. I think there's been an isolated outbreak in Germany. And in America, there are some states in America beginning to do local lockdowns. That is very likely to happen to avoid a mass lockdown. The circle of control, this is your most powerful. And this is what people will remember, I have to say. And the great thing about this is you can control it because it's your behavior. And I think there are 7 key behaviors here to really start thinking about in terms of your own behaviors as senior leaders in the coming weeks. Listen, learn, and act. That will enable you to move fast when you need to and to move carefully. If you've got your finger on the pulse of what's happening, you can make those decisions very quickly. But you do need to listen. Clear, simple, regular communication with people. I don't think you can over communicate in this sort of scenario, and really explaining to people why you are doing what you're doing in the way that you're doing it. I think, Delia, you talked about staff and the issues with staff and who's in and who's out and being equitable. Actually, when you explain why you're doing something, people will understand the equity there and explain that. Make it simple to people. Collaborate creatively. You'll have problems to solve. They're not for you alone as the head teacher and the senior team to solve. We think we're the head, we're paid the big bucks, we've got to solve these problems. You can't, but actually teams can. And when you start talking through problems together, you will all come up with creative ways. Somebody will come up with an idea that somebody else builds on. And although you may not have the expertise in your team immediately, someone will know someone who has got the expertise. So as long as you've got everything on the table and you're talking openly with each other, you will find the solution. So I would encourage you to read widely. ASCL, if you're a member of ASCL, give daily updates, and they're really useful. They synthesize everything to help you be clear in your thinking. Set some really clear priorities for September to December. That is a critical period. Think of it as your first 100 days. That's September to December. Where do you want to be in December within your school, within your local context? It doesn't matter what the school down the road is doing. It doesn't matter what the school on Twitter is doing. It doesn't matter what the BBC is reporting some schools are doing. You're in charge of your school and your context. Clear delegation using that expertise. Let people go and do the job you're trusting them to do, with opportunities for regular review. Watch behaviours. When people come back in September, watch them closely, because they will all have experienced lockdown differently. And if you have a member of staff that is talking about the minutiae of detail around the guidance, it is likely that that member of staff has struggled during lockdown. So give them the support that they need. And reflect. Use these next few weeks to reflect with your team. What's worked? What will you keep? What will you get rid of? What hasn't worked? Give yourself some headspace to do that. And again, reading is really important. Things like Harvard Business Review, London Business School, although they're not necessarily educationally focused, they are throwing forward a lot of articles around leading in a crisis. And there's a lot of really good information in there. And finally, take control, be brave. You know your school, you know what you need. Take time in September to find out where everybody is, because unless you know exactly where they are, you cannot possibly plan effectively, and it may take you a little bit of time. And that future that you're going to create, where do you want your school to be in December? Where do we hope it will be? And what have you therefore got to do in order to get there? And the final thing I would say is that it will actually be your behaviour that everybody remembers. And the great thing about that is it's your circle of control. You've got a direct impact that way. So thank you very much, everybody. I've gone on a little bit longer and not left a great deal of time for questions, but I wonder if there are any immediate questions or thoughts. You're very welcome to email me afterwards. I mean, Sarah, Kate, I'm happy for you to share my email address with everybody that's been on the call. And I mean that genuinely. If you want to get hold of me, that's absolutely fine. But are there any immediate thoughts or comments, questions?